Thank you for joining me. I want to start tonight from a slightly different place, perhaps one we don't often think about in the frantic rush of our daily lives. Right now, at this very moment, think about how my voice is reaching you, or the news you scroll through on your phone while drinking your morning coffee, the videos you watch, the messages you send to your loved ones. We like to think that all this data floats through the air, descending from the clouds in invisible waves, right? We call it the cloud. But the truth is, the backbone of our digital lives, our economy, our security is not in the clouds. It's at the bottom of the ocean, in those glass fiber cables as thin as a human hair, lying on the ocean floor under immense pressure, cold and dark. Those thin threads connecting the world. Now, I want you to picture a scene in your mind. Put the maps and charts aside. Just imagine. Location: the northern waters off Scotland. The air is freezing, the North Sea's infamous bone-chilling gray mist enveloping everything. Below, kilometers beneath the sea, lie those vital cables connecting England to the world. And above, among the waves, is a strange ship. Its name, Yantar. According to official records, it's an ocean research vessel. How innocent, right? Scientific curiosity, perhaps studying whales, perhaps measuring the salt content of the water. But there are no scientists on this ship's deck. Beneath its hull are robotic arms and mini-submarines designed to descend to the ocean's deepest points, to cut, listen to, or sabotage those thin cables. What happened off the coast of Scotland this week was not scientific research. It was a scene from a horror movie. And imagine this. You are a Royal Air Force pilot. You are in a P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft. Your mission is to monitor this ship, the Yantar, which is making suspicious movements in international waters. It's a night flight. Below is pitch black, only the dim light of the instruments in your cockpit. And suddenly, a blinding green beam of light bursts from that dark ship below, straight into your cockpit. A laser. This is not a "you're too close" warning. This is a military laser weapon. Think about that moment. That light could permanently blind you. It could fry your aircraft's sensors. It could leave you blind and helpless in the middle of that dark sea. That was exactly what the reports on British Defense Secretary John Healey's desk said. And the response from London was not one of those polite diplomatic phrases we've grown accustomed to over the years. Healey spoke in a tone that Putin would understand, almost inviting a street fight. "We see you, we see your lasers. If that ship dares to head south, we are ready." We are ready. Hearing that word made my hair stand on end, because this is no longer Cold War rhetoric. In the Cold War, there were rules. There were red phones. The boundaries were clear. What happened in the skies over Scotland this week, while not a declaration of war, was that final moment before the trigger was pulled, a gray zone war. What I've described so far paints a frightening portrait of a superpower, doesn't it? A technological giant that controls the oceans, blinds aircraft in the sky with lasers, has eyes everywhere, and is invincible. This is the Russia that Vladimir Putin wants the world to believe in, that enormous shadow saying, "Fear us." But this is the most interesting part of the story, the part that made me think the most and prompted me to take this microphone tonight. Because that same week, that same Navy showed us another face of this empire of fear. And this face was far removed from the futuristic glare of laser weapons. Now we're changing the scene. We're leaving the tense atmosphere of Scotland and heading to the Baltic Sea, a little further east. Again, a gray sea. Again, cold waters. But this time there are no lasers, high technology, or frightening displays of power on stage. This time on stage, there is smoke. A silhouette appears on the horizon. This is the pride of the Russian Navy, NATO codenamed Kilo-class, a submarine that Putin boasts is a silent killer, Novorossiysk. Normally, these submarines are known as the black holes of the ocean. They are invisible. They are silent. You cannot see them until they find you. But tonight, the Novorossiysk is not silent. It is not invisible. This massive war machine, instead of gliding beneath the water like a mysterious hunter, is bobbing on the surface like a buoy. And do you know what's most painful? It's not even going on its own. There's a tugboat in front of it, tied with rusty ropes, broken down, tired, exhausted like a whale. It's being towed across the Baltic Sea. On one side, the audacious superpower blinding pilots in the skies over Scotland. On the other, a helpless pile of metal, dependent on a rescue tugboat in the Baltic Sea, its own backyard. This image This is not just a maritime accident. It is an X-ray of an empire. What I want to tell you tonight is the story of the chasm between these two images, the story of the dark truth behind those laser lights, of rusted bolts and collapsing logistics, the story of how Putin's invincible fleet ran aground in the cold waters of the Baltic and became the greatest walk of shame in history. And believe me, this story tells us much more than those lasers ever could about our future, about the nature of war, and about the price of arrogance. If you're ready, let's follow the smoky trail of that tugboat and dive into the depths of this event, into that rusty hull. Now I'm taking you from Scotland a little further east to that narrow claustrophobic entrance to the Baltic Sea, the Kattegat Strait. Date, October 16th. I want you to pause here and really feel the atmosphere of that moment. Because the phrase, Russian submarine tracked by Sweden in the news bulletins doesn't do justice to the drama that unfolded there. That phrase is too sterile, too dry. What happened there was far from sterile. Close your eyes and picture the scene. The sea is gray, the sky is gray, the horizon is lost in the fog. The air is cold, the wind hitting your face is salty and harsh. And in the middle of this grayness, there is a huge jet black shape on the water. This is the Novorossiysk. Under normal circumstances, the image that should come to mind when you hear this name is one of deadly silence gliding through the depths. But what you see now is not that. What you see is a pile of suffering metal. Imagine the smell that hits your nose, that suffocating smell of burnt oil and poorly refined diesel fuel mixed with the salty sea air. The soot from the submarine's funnel, yes, because it's on the surface, it has to run its diesel engines, and black smoke rises from its funnel, falls onto the white-capped waves, the sound of the engine. It's not the rhythmic, reassuring noise of a healthy machine. It's more like the groaning of a giant that's faltering, coughing, struggling. And the most painful, most shameful detail, it's not alone. In front of it is a Russian tugboat named Yakov Grabelsky. Between them are stretched rusty ropes. A huge war machine, part of a superpower's claim to nuclear deterrence, is helplessly dragged along on the ends of those ropes like a child's toy. This scene alone is sad enough, isn't it? A picture of what the once proud Soviet legacy. But the story doesn't end there. The real tension lies in what surrounds this rusty convoy. Because on that day, it wasn't just the Russians on those gray waters. Futuristic, angular, oddly shaped ships appeared around them, cutting through the surface of the sea like a knife. These were the pride of the Swedish Royal Navy, Visby-class corvettes. And I don't know if you've ever seen these ships. If you haven't, it might be a little hard to imagine. They look like something out of a science fiction movie. They have almost no protrusions. Smooth, gray, carbon fiber hulls. They appear smaller on radar than even a fishing boat. They call them invisible daggers. That immense contrast on the scene takes my breath away. On one side, a noisy, smoky, rusty, clunky Russian submarine from the 20th century. On the other, silent, invisible, deadly, modern Swedish ghost ships. The Swedes had formed a circle around the Russian submarine, but this was not a friendly escort mission. This was an encirclement. This was a suffocating embrace. And not just at sea. Imagine looking up. Can you hear that piercing jet noise coming through the clouds? They were there too. The Swedish Air Force's Gripen jets. The Eagles of the North, with that deadly payload under their wings, Meteor missiles. They were circling above Novorossiysk. Now let's try to empathize for a moment. I know it's hard, but let's try. Imagine you are the Russian crew trapped inside that submarine, inside that narrow metal tube. Imagine you are the captain. Below, there is a fire hazard in the engine room. The air is toxic due to a fuel leak. You have to go outside. You can't hide. You have lost your stealth. You're exposed. And when you look out through the periscope or climb up to the conning tower and breathe that cold air, what do you see? Swedish barrels aimed at you from every angle, every second. 57mm Bofors guns, RBS-15 missiles, all turned towards you. Was it fear that the crew felt? I think there was something heavier than fear there, humiliation. Because for soldiers, especially sailors, being killed by the enemy is a risk, yes. But being reduced to a pitiful state by the enemy? That is what inflicts irreparable wounds on a soldier's soul. Do you know what the Swedish Army called this operation in its official statement? A routine mission. Routine. Can you feel the icy arrogance in that word, that condescension? They were actually saying, you are not a threat to us. You are a nuisance, a traffic problem. But this wasn't a cat and mouse game. It wasn't a thriller like the ones we see in Hollywood movies, where you hear sonar ping detected dive. As PPR Global's sharp analysts put it, this wasn't a hunt, it was a live autopsy. Why do I say autopsy? Because an autopsy is performed to understand why a dead body died, right? You reveal its secrets. That's exactly what Sweden and NATO did that day. They opened the lid of that closed paranoid box that was the Russian Navy and looked inside. Normally, a submarine underwater is a mystery, a question. You wonder, where is it? What can it do? But a submarine that has surfaced, belching smoke, malfunctioning, it is no longer a question mark. It is a pile of data. The Swedish ships, those Visby corvettes, didn't just turn their guns and wait. They opened their sensors, cameras, hydrophones, their underwater microphones to the max. They recorded every sound that submarine made, every metallic vibration of its propeller, every sick cough of its engine. Do you know what that means? It means handing over a person's fingerprints, retina scans, voice recordings, and DNA samples to the police all at once. For NATO intelligence officers, this moment was a gold mine they couldn't have obtained even if they had spent billions of dollars. They now know the acoustic signature, or sound character, of the Novorossiysk, and indeed of all other Russian submarines in its class, by heart. Russia wasn't just trying to keep one ship afloat in the Baltic that day. Russia was losing the mystery it had carefully built over decades in the Baltic that day. They called these ships silent killers, black holes in the ocean. There were no black holes in the Baltic that day, just a rusty, noisy, and very, very lonely pile of metal. And here's the really interesting part. Sweden is the star of this scene. Let's think about this for a moment. Sweden, the Sweden we know for its IKEA, meatballs, Nobel Peace Prizes, and neutrality. The country that said, we don't get involved, we're neutral, for years throughout the Cold War. That day, there in the middle of the Baltic, it was like a cool-headed surgeon waiting with a scalpel in hand. How did this change happen? How did the peaceful Scandinavian suddenly turn into a Russian hunting Viking? Can this be explained solely by NATO membership? No, its roots go much deeper into the dusty pages of history and, believe me, a very strange whiskey story. Yes, you heard right, whiskey. But before we get to that story, let's take one last look at the horizon through the eyes of the Russian sailors on the deck of that rusty submarine. What they saw through the smoke wasn't just Swedish ships. What they saw was Putin's greatest strategic nightmare come true. So how did we get to this point? Why was this autopsy table set up right here in the middle of the Baltic? To understand this, we need to go back a bit, zoom out on the map, and, as I said, remember that famous whiskey incident. Whiskey, I said, right? No, I'm not going to give you a recipe for a drink. But the incident I'm referring to is one of the most absurd, most comical, and for the Swedes, most traumatic moments in Cold War history. And to understand today's harsh Swedish reaction, we need to know about that foggy morning. Date, October 27, 1981. Location, the Karlskrona military base in southern Sweden. In other words, the heart of the Swedish Navy. Early that morning, a Swedish fishing boat cuts through the fog and spots a strange shadow ahead. A massive metal hulk beached on the rocks lying on its side. The fisherman can't believe his eyes, because what he sees is a Soviet submarine, NATO codename Whiskey S-363. But can you imagine? One of the world's most powerful nuclear forces had entered the heart of Sweden's most secret military base and run aground on the rocks like a drunk driver. The incident made headlines in the world press as Whiskey on the Rocks. Do you know what the Russian captain's defense was? Navigation error. They claimed their compasses were broken. When the Swedes boarded the ship, they whispered that the captain and crew were not exactly sober, but that wasn't the scary part. When the Swedes scanned the ship with radiation detectors, they realized there were nuclear torpedoes inside that rusty hull. What did Sweden do that day? It issued diplomatic notes. It protested. It allowed Russian rescue ships to come and take the submarine, albeit with some grumbling. Because at that time, Sweden was neutral. It was alone. And facing it was the giant Soviet bear. They were afraid. That submarine was a slap in the face to Sweden's sovereignty, and Sweden had to swallow that slap. That is why when we return to October 2025, that scene in the Baltic Sea is so important. Today, when Swedish commanders look at that Novorossiysk submarine, they don't just see a malfunctioning vessel, they see the revenge of 1981. Sweden, humiliated in its own waters that day, is now the one humiliating Russia. The roles have reversed 180 degrees. The timid country that used to say, let's not anger the Russians, is gone. There is now a Viking wearing a NATO badge saying, we see you, we hear you, and we hunt you. Well, let's put this history lesson aside and get to the real question, the big picture. Now, many of you may be thinking, okay, the submarine broke down, these things happen, machines break down, but why is this submarine in the Baltic Sea? Why is it making this walk of shame right under the noses of the UK, France, and Sweden? Where is this submarine's home? The Black Sea. Where was its mission? Syria, the Mediterranean. So why didn't it go to the nearest repair shop? Why wasn't it repaired at the Russian base in Tartus, Syria? Or why didn't it pass through the straits and return home to the Black Sea? Here we encounter the unsexy, rarely seen in Hollywood films, yet decisive face of war, logistics. And on this logistics map, there is a very critical actor that closed the doors and locked the gates for Russia, Turkey. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, Ankara made a very critical decision. It fully exercised the authority granted to it by international law, the Montreux Convention, and it said, no passage for warships. At that moment, Russia's vital artery between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean was cut off. Imagine, there's a fire in your house, but the water pipes have been cut off. That's Russia's situation. The Black Sea Fleet is trapped in its own sea. The ships remaining in the Mediterranean cannot return home. Russia's famous Tartus base in Syria was once the center of its forces in the Middle East. But now, are you following what Ukraine is doing? Ukraine, a country without a navy, has made the Black Sea narrow for Russian ships, with its unmanned naval vehicles, drones, which they call Sea Baby. It has now become impossible for Russia to send materials, spare parts, and expert personnel from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The port of Tartus is no longer a military base. It's an isolated island. There are no spare parts. There is no expert team. There is no logistical support. This is where the tragedy of the Novorossiysk submarine begins. I read the analyses of H.R. Sutton, one of the legendary names in the open source intelligence OSINT world, this week. He points out the same thing. He says, this ship's problem is not just engine failure. This ship is dying of neglect. When it broke down off the coast of Syria, Russian commanders looked at the map and saw the terrifying truth. There was nowhere to go. They can't repair it in Tartus. There are no parts. They can't return home to the Black Sea. The Turks have closed the straits. That leaves only one option, to go to the shipyards in St. Petersburg, 6,000 kilometers away. And imagine, your car's engine is sputtering, the brakes aren't working, oil is leaking, and your mechanic isn't across the street, but on the other side of the world. And to get there, you have to pass through the neighborhood's most dangerous characters, NATO's backyard. And that's what we call the Gate of Shame. This voyage was not a transfer, it was a flag race. But it wasn't the Russians carrying the flag, it was the NATO fleets. They first tracked the ship off the coast of Portugal, then the French took over. When it entered the English Channel, the Royal Navy frigate said welcome, then Belgium, then the Netherlands. Each one passed that rusty submarine through their waters like a criminal, like a leper, and handed it over to the next ally. And do you know who summed up this process best? NATO's new boss, Secretary General Mark Rutte. When journalists asked him about the situation, he didn't wear his politician's mask. He responded with a very clear, even somewhat cruel joke. Referring to Tom Clancy's famous novel, The Hunt for Red October, the one with Sean Connery. This doesn't look much like The Hunt for Red Octobers, Rutte said. It's more like Operation Find the Nearest Repair Shop. You can imagine the laughter in the room. But no one in Moscow was laughing, because that sentence did more damage to the Russian Navy than a torpedo. Putin's superpower image sank to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, along with those laughs. Because the strength of an army isn't measured only by the missiles it fires. The strength of an army is measured by whether it can bring home a wounded ship without humiliating itself before the enemy. Russia failed to do that. And now I want to get to the final point that all these technical details, these historical references, this logistical nightmare have brought us to. That big philosophical question. What does this incident tell us about the wars of the future? And why are the waters of the Baltic Sea now so much colder than before? We'll discuss this in the finale shortly. Tonight, we've been on a very long and strange journey together. We started in those icy, dark waters off the coast of Scotland. There, we witnessed a green laser beam piercing the pitch-black night, a futuristic threat attempting to blind British pilots, the ship Yantar. Then we turned east. We plunged into the gray, turbulent waves of the Baltic Sea. And there, we encountered a completely different scene. We watched the once proud giant, the pride of the Russian Navy, the silent killer Novorossiysk, clinging to the rusty ropes of a tugboat, its engine coughing, drifting in a cloud of smoke. Before concluding this broadcast, I want you to picture these two images side by side in your mind. Freeze these two frames. On the left, a high-tech, threatening shadow armed with laser weapons. On the right, a rusted, immobile, helpless heap of metal. At first glance, these seem like two opposing, contradictory stories, don't they? One shouts, "I am powerful," while the other whispers, "I am dying." One represents the war of the future, the other the wreckage of the past. But no, if we look a little closer, if we delve a little deeper beneath that rusted hull into the circuits of that laser, we see that these two ships are actually telling us one and the same story. This is the story of Vladimir Putin's Russia. This is the story of a schizophrenic superpower, a system that, with one hand, reaches for space and tries to shoot down satellites, hacks the world with its cyber armies, but with the other hand, cannot find boots for its own soldiers or engine gaskets for its own ships. That gate of shame we saw tonight was not a simple maritime accident. Those fumes were not just the smoke of burning diesel. That smoke was the massive illusion, marketed for 25 years as Russia is back, evaporating before our eyes. Let's start by laying this map out on the table. But I'm not talking about a map on paper. I'm talking about a map of power and fear. Since the day he came to power, Vladimir Putin has repeated a single mantra, lived with a single fear. We are being surrounded. When the first tanks entered Ukraine, when Crimea was annexed, what was the fundamental justification underlying all those speeches? To push NATO away from our borders. Putin wanted to break the circle around Russia. So today, on this cold October night in 2025, what do we see when we look at the route of that rusty submarine? The answer to this question is a disaster for Russian strategy. Novorossiysk's journey was a humiliating one. The Baltic Sea. It has been Russia's lungs throughout history. What did Peter the Great say when he founded St. Petersburg 300 years ago? Here, we will open a window to Europe. That window was Russia's windpipe. But today, that window has been bricked up. The submarine looks to the right, the coast of Finland, now NATO territory. That country of thousands of lakes is no longer a friendly buffer zone for Russia, but an armed fortress. It looks to the left, the coast of Sweden. Sweden, which has been neutral for centuries, saying, "We won't get involved," now a NATO member. And as we saw tonight, a hunter bold enough to perform a live autopsy on Russian ships. It looks down, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, Denmark. All of them, without exception, are NATO members. While Putin wanted to push NATO away, he brought the alliance right under his bedroom window, right up to the fences in his garden. The Baltic Sea is no longer a gateway to the world for Russia. The Baltic Sea is now a claustrophobic, suffocating NATO tunnel for the Russian Navy, every meter of which is monitored by sensors. Those historic ports in St. Petersburg, those much-feared missile bases in Kaliningrad, they are no longer centers of power. They are now, in a moment of crisis, rat holes that can be blockaded by the NATO Navy in minutes. That superpower map has now turned into a prison plan. And the architect of this prison is not NATO generals. It is none other than Vladimir Putin himself, that strategic genius in the Kremlin. So is this collapse only on the map? No. The real decay is inside that ship, in the sound of that engine. Many of you may be asking, can't Big Russia repair a submarine? Why are they so helpless? The answer to this question lies in the invisible weapon of modern warfare: sanctions and technology embargoes. For years, you have heard analyses saying, sanctions are not working, the Russian economy is growing. You've seen reports with manipulated figures, but the sea doesn't lie. Machines don't lie. Why couldn't that submarine's engine be repaired? Because the critical parts of that engine, its gaskets, its electronic circuits, are no longer coming to Russia. Without high technology from the West, Russian industry is struggling to keep even the Soviet junk from the 1980s afloat. There's a term I read in PPR Global Reports that's very striking. Cannibalism. No, not human cannibalism. Technological cannibalism. The Russian army dismantles 2 planes to fly 1. It dismantles one submarine to float another. They sacrifice the sound to keep the sick alive. That black smoke from Novorossiysk isn't actually burning diesel fuel. It's the smoke of an industry consuming itself. That ship is living proof of how a propaganda slogan like "everything we have is domestic and national" rusts and crumbles when cut off from the global supply chain. However, and this is the most critical point of the night, please listen carefully here. This is precisely where we must not become complacent. The Russian army's helpless state, those rusty ships, the collapsing logistics, should not lead us into the misconception that Russia is finished, the danger has passed. On the contrary, what in nature is more dangerous than a wounded, cornered, humiliated animal? Let's return to those Scottish waters, to that laser-equipped ship, the Yantar. What was that ship's mission? That ship is not a warship. That ship has no cannons, no missiles. That ship's weapon is a knife pressed against the very heart of your life, against the backbone of your modern world. Those internet cables at the bottom of the ocean, natural gas pipelines, power transmission lines. Russia learned the hard way on the deck of that rusty submarine that it cannot compete with NATO in conventional warfare, i.e., field battles. They cannot defeat Europe with tanks, cannons, and ships. So what remains? What remains is asymmetric warfare. What remains is the gray zone. Novorossiysk may not be able to sink a submarine fleet, but Yantar can bring down the London Stock Exchange by cutting a single cable, by touching a single strategic point. It can lock down your hospital systems. It can cut off your city's electricity. It can silence your cell phone. Russian generals are now thinking, we cannot defeat you on the battlefield, but we can strike you at home, in your comfort zone, in your economy. We can plunge you into chaos. This is war coming home. War is no longer just in Ukraine's muddy trenches. War is on the seabed of Scotland. War is in your bank account. The war is in your modem. The smoke from Novorossiysk tells us our system is collapsing, but the lasers of Yantar whisper to us, as we fall, we are ready to pull you down with us, to extinguish your lights too. So don't laugh at that rusty ship. That desperation could push the Kremlin into riskier, crazier, more reckless moves. The most dangerous moment for an empire is not when it is strongest, but when it senses its death and makes its final desperate struggle. Right now, as we speak, that submarine, the Novorossiysk, continues to drift toward St. Petersburg. And I think of the 80 sailors inside that metal tube. Those young men breathing that toxic air for days, crushed by the engine noise and the harassment of NATO ships. What will happen when they reach their port? What will they feel when they disembark and set foot on land, when they return to their homeland? Do you know what they will see when they go home and turn on the television? They will watch the victories of the heroic Russian Navy. They will listen to the speeches of the invincible leader Putin. They will watch that wind of lies telling them that everything is fine, that Russia is racing from one victory to another. But they know the truth. They saw the rust. They smelled the decay. They saw the pain in the enemy's eyes. That deep silence the sailors experienced. That chasm between lies and truth. It's not missiles from outside that destroy empires. It's that silent awakening. A regime collapses not when it loses its tanks, but when it loses the faith in the eyes of its own soldiers, its own people. No matter how bright the lights in the window, the back of the shop is empty. No matter how far the lasers illuminate, the ship is taking on water below. History teaches us this. Great empires do not collapse with massive explosions or apocalyptic wars, as depicted in Hollywood films. Most of the time, they rust away from neglect, exhaustion, lies, and arrogance. Squeaking and needing the rope of an enemy tugboat, they quietly and shamefully leave the stage. This week, we witnessed not just a ship, but a mindset, an era running aground. But don't take your eyes off those laser lights, because sinking ships create whirlpools, and that whirlpool is still very dangerous for all of us. Thank you for joining me and following this long story with me. I'm Nicole. Keep your eyes on the horizon, your mind in the depths. Good night.